Hello everyone, my name is Ejaz Hussain. I'm a developer and architect and work for a company called Content and Cloud. And here is my LinkedIn and Twitter handle. If you want to get in touch, please use these handles. So today topic we are looking into it, how can we access the Azure resource securely using the Azure API management approach from the SharePoint online via the SPFx Webpart. So we'll see what's in there. So what we're trying to achieve. So the goal is basically we have a SharePoint online platform, we have SPFx Webpart, and we wanted to get the data from the Microsoft Azure Story Table. Now, what are the options we have? One option, so that's the main goal. So we want to get the data from Azure Story Table. And by the way, this could be any Azure resource you are communicating, so it depends on what you're trying to do. So now, what are the options we have? One option is we can use the usual secured Azure function way or Azure web app way, so where you making a request, calling Azure function, and Azure function is basically going and get a Azure table data for you and sending you back. Then which normally we implement that one. And another approach today, which today we are looking into it, how can we make use of Azure API management way, which basically technically you are directly dealing with your endpoint, API endpoints. So you don't have to go via Azure function and Azure web app. And if you're in the green, you can see for each approach, there are some benefits and there are some drawbacks. So for the Azure function one, if you look first, you see this quite simple to set up and cost effective and suitable for smaller API deployments. But whereas, but it has the limited API management capability, require more manual configuration for security and governance. But on the other hand, we have Azure API management. It's quite comprehensive API management capabilities, suitable for large API deployments, and it's got out-of-the-box robust security and governance features. So what are the drawbacks? It's more complex to set up compared to what a secured Azure function. It can be more expensive for smaller projects. So it depends on your type of project you're working on. You can choose the option which can work for you. So if we look into today's solution architecture, what we have built. So what we built is we've got SPFx Webpart, and we have got the Azure Public API endpoint, which we got from the Azure API management after all the configurations. So what we're doing is we calling that API, our Public API endpoint, and then via the SPFx Webpart. But before we call that, we also had some authentication to do. Like SPFx Webpart is getting authenticated to Azure API management via the Azure Authenticate with Azure AD token. So we'll be registering a app first in Azure AD, and then we use that app to get the token, and we pass that token part of the request when we call this Azure Public API endpoint. Once we get to the Azure API management, and we have some other validation checkpoints, like we have a codes, we have a valid audience, we have a make sure the client ID, the request will come from, make sure it's the same as we are expecting, tenant IDs, what we're expecting. So everything is handled in policies in the Azure API management, and then the Azure management then is got authenticated via the managed identity to Azure Story Table. And this is where we get the data. So Azure API management get the data for you and then send you back to the SPFx Webpart. So that's the whole solution architecture. So before we go into more detail, let's jump on the demo first. So if I go in here and we say, let me reload. So I'm going to click on view Azure table data. So you see that it's already logged, authenticated. And so if you click on this one, it's going to go and connect to Azure API management and bring our data from the Azure table. Here we go. So we've got this data, and it's basically this just a sample records available in the Azure table storage, and that's what I'm calling. Now, how do we get from here to get the data without any how do we set up the Azure API management, etc. So before we go to setup, so let me give you the code first. So what's the code So let me show you the code first. So here is the solution. So first of all, I have a three property pane fields. One is a subscription key, which we can get from the API management portal in Azure. Then scope URL. I mean, you don't have to have a separate property pane field here, but it's good for the configuration. You can use in the Webpart directly. And then this is the table endpoint. This is the API endpoint for the Azure table storage. So once we got all these things, then we can go to the actual Azure solution. So we are basically on load. We are calling this guy, call Azure resources. We're getting the access token first, and the access token is same usual way. We're using the AED token provider and passing the scope URL. And once we got the token, then we're passing this token to the get Azure table data. We're passing this token to this function, and then it's using that token as well as the subscription key, and then calling our table endpoint. And then this is where we get the data. Now, to get this, first of all, we need to go to Azure. You need to go to Azure AD, register an app, which is I have done O365-SP and then you make sure you have a create show expose add a scope, which is the so click on it. It's like a user underscore impressionate. So once you have done this, there's no need to add any permissions whatsoever. This is just for authentication, no secret. You can leave everything by default. So then you go to your app Webpart, go to your config solution. You can see you have Azure underscore impressions, and then the name of your Azure AD app under the web API permissions. When you deploy this one, make sure you grant the permission to this one. And what we will do that it will help us to generate a token, which we can pass as a part of the request to the Azure API management. So once we got the token, I can show you the quick token as well. So this is the token which we got from and you can see the audience is my client ID and my tenant, and then I have the app ID, which is the SPFx out of the default app registration ID, which is help us to get the token. So we have the audience there, we have the app ID there, and then we can go and pass this token to the Azure API management. Now let's go to the Azure API management resource. First of all, we go in here, we just go to system, we go in there, manage identities, we enable the manage identity for that, because we need that to get authenticated with Azure Story Table. I have created a new product. You can create any product here. So I've created Office 365 portal, and then within the product, you can create multiple APIs. So in my case, I've added Azure Table Storage API, and then added an operation code. I wanted to get the entities from the table. You can see my front end, my get URL is same because there's no other API endpoint available in that when we call the Azure Story Table endpoint REST API. And then this is important, inbound processing. So what it is basically, you can add cores, you can add, so this is very important. So inbound processing, you can see, you can define the cores. So make sure where you wanted to get the request should come from the valid audience. And then you have a validate Azure AD token. You can define validation for your Azure AD token. So whatever the validation you have in there, if that has passed, then it goes to the next step, and then you go and call your the backend service. So let me show you what it looks like in actually without exposing my tenant details. So you can see here under the cores you have a define the origin. So make sure it's coming from your tenant. So if you send a request somewhere else, it won't allow you to process. Then you have another Azure AD token validation. So this is a policy which you can define. This is the tenant ID I'm expecting, and then this is the two application ID which will be part of that request. One for the SharePoint Online Client Extensibility Web Application Principle, the default one for SPFx. The second one which we created the client ID for that. So you need to specify here. Then part of that token, I'm also wanted to check the audience is exactly the same as I have here defined. So now you have these two checkpoint here. So if the request comes from a valid audience, valid region, then it will go to the next step. This is where you can basically intercept the request, what is coming. If everything validation has been passed, then here I'm calling just basically at the endpoint. You can construct the API URL where you want to set the backend service from here. And then once you've done this, the next step is basically how do you authenticate Azure API management with the Azure storage. That's where you add this line called authenticate managed entity resource equal to this. And then before you do that, make sure you go to the Azure storage and go to the access control and add this as a role assignment for your API management resource as a storage table data reader in my case, but depend on what do you want to give this role. So when the Azure API management try to connect to the Azure storage table, it basically it has the permission to do that. Now, once you've done that, you simply go. This get automatically calculated based on what you have done in set backend service, so you don't have to add it by yourself. So you can see it's dynamically been updated. And then once that's done, it will send the data back to your SPFx Webpart. So you come back and so there you go. So you go back, and then this will send you the data back, and then here we go. So I mean, this is a basic introduction of how you can use of Azure API management. But yeah, this is a huge area that can be quite useful if you are dealing with less posts where you wanted to keep your backend unexposed to the client apps, and might be your secured application or something. So the user doesn't know, and they don't have to know what kind of backend service is being used, what kind of credential is being used, etc. Or you have to set up everything in the Azure API management. And again, it depends on your types of applications you're building. So that's all from me. Let me know if you have any question. Thank you. So one last thing before I say, I forgot. So please go on my blog. I've wrote the blog post and I listed a step-by-step implementation, step 1, step 2, what you need to do. So please go through that if you're interested to replicate what I've shown you today. Right, thank you.
Today, my topic is on managing SharePoint webhook subscriptions using SPFx. This is a simple Webpart, which displays the list of webhooks and action to renew the webhook expiry dates of respective webhook subscriptions. So before I jump into the demo, I would like to introduce myself quite briefly. My name is Nishkalank. People call me as Nish. I'm working as a senior RAM 365 technical specialist at Tietoevry Create based in Stockholm. I am an active PNP community contributor, and these are the badges for my contributions which I've got so far, and many more are yet to come. These are the few links where you can reach me out, but I am mostly active on Discord server. So today's agenda, I will be focusing on SharePoint webhooks, the use case which I have followed, the web part, and a brief demo about SharePoint webhooks. SharePoint webhooks enables us to build applications that subscribe to receive notifications on specific events that occur in SharePoint. So these specific events may be a document is added, deleted, checked out, checked in, etc. SharePoint webhooks are easier to develop and consume than that of remote event receivers, as remote event receivers uses the idea of using SOAP endpoint, usually implemented using WCF, wherein webhooks uses regular HTTP services like web APIs. List webhooks covers the vast range of list events corresponding to the list item changes. The list event types are listed out on the right hand side of the screen. These includes item added, updated, deleted, checked out, checked in, unchecked out, file moved, version deleted, etc., etc. SharePoint webhooks also provide a simple notification pipeline so your application can be aware of what changes it is doing. or it is getting. So the use case which I have used is from the Microsoft documentation itself. I have not completely implemented this, but I have implemented in a similar way as shown in the figure. I have created a SharePoint webhook as an Azure function, which uses the HTTP trigger. The function URL is then added as a webhook subscription to the intended lists or libraries. This function will be triggered whenever there is a change in lists or libraries. Once it is triggered, the function will receive the notification from the SharePoint and processes the notification. This notification is then added to the storage queue for further processing using a queue trigger function. You may either add this notification to queues or directly process this notification in the same function, but it is recommended to add it to the queue so you maintain the records of the notification. The most important part here is the get changes CSOM API, which is used during the processing the notification. This API is to determine what actually has changed on that particular item. This is a basic scenario, as we all know, and hence can be implemented in many different ways. I myself have used this in my previous projects where we had to manage all these subscriptions at hub level individually or using an automated script. So when I said the word managing here, it is because the webhook subscriptions are set to expire after 180 days by default. And we have many ways to renew the webhook subscriptions. The most effective way I would say is to use PowerShell. But then this is where my idea has come to implement this or like implement it using a Webpart, which uses REST API, making some simple HTTP calls. So the this web part sample is developed to renew the subscription date of the list webhooks. A simple one. The idea of this web part was that I have set this web part at hub level, assuming that I can fetch all the sites which are associated to the hub, and it lists sites and as well as its lists which are available. On list or library selections, the available webhook subscriptions are displayed accordingly. If the webhook is expired, the Webpart gives us the possibility to renew the subscription via Webpart. So now let me quickly show you the Webpart. All right. This is the web part which I have configured. There are no web part properties which are being used. So I'll skip the part of editing and showing the web part properties here, editing the web part. So on here, I mean, I have a drop down which fetches all the lists, sorry, all the sites which are associated to the hub site. So on selection or like on selection of a particular site, there will be another drop down which will be popped out, which shows like select list from the so and so selected site. So if I choose any of the lists and libraries from the drop down, it will show me the subscriptions which are available on that particular list. So likewise, I mean, I can just click around and then see if there are any expired webhooks. So let's see if uh, this particular on this particular library, there's a webhook which has been expired on 10th of October. So here, on clicking on the link, the subscription will be renewed and the expiry date is set to 180 days from today. So let me show you that. So I'll be clicking it. So yeah, the webhook has been now uh, has a new expiry date. This is a brief, demo of the web part. So let me come back to the presentation. I'll show you a quick, code samples. So here, get subscriptions methods uses get and fetches all the available subscriptions for that particular list. And renewing the subscriptions, I used a patch method and sent a payload which has expiration date time and the notification URL. So here, this is the get method from my REST services and the patch method. Both get and patch methods are simple HTTP calls as shown. Here in the patch method, if the subscription is found and successfully updated, the response status is 204 and no content is being returned. So this sample is available in PNP samples gallery. And this is an apt sample or example on how we can work on SharePoint webhook subscriptions, which can be, of course, be improved in any way that is appropriate for our own needs. So with this, I conclude my second demo in the community. I thank everybody. I thank the community for recognizing and giving me this opportunity today. I thank Vesa, David, Hugo from the community team. You are awesome. Thanks to Giacomo, Joel Rodriguez, Adam Wojcik for your constant support. I personally thank Pascal Sok from Tietoevry for always backing me. Thank you, everybody. You guys rock. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic. And this is definitely a Webpart that I will be using because it solves another real world problem. All right. So now we had two wonderful demos and then we'll have mine. So let's get started. And hopefully you can see my screen. Okay. So today's demo is about building a cascading dropdowns in SPFx solutions. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably saying, "Hey, is that not a beginner concept that's in the Microsoft documentation?" Well, the documentation has been around since 2017. It's not a new concept, but SPFx has changed since then. And the article that discusses cascading dropdowns has evolved over time. It's got updates, but we never really shared the completed code. So what we did recently is we had someone in the community reach out and said, "Hey, in Stack Overflow, how do I use the code in this article? I really want to do a cascading dropdown, but I can't get the code to work." So we decided let's create an SPFx sample in the sample repository, and let's make sure that it's got a companion article with it. So let's show you what the Webpart does to start with. So this is a Webpart that when you go to the property pane, you'll have two dropdowns, a list for you to select which list you want to go from, and the items that you want to select. When you pick a list, it'll actually filter the items, and it will only let you select items from that list that you've selected. If you change the list, it'll actually show a different set of items that you can pick from. So it's a relatively simple concept, obviously, but it's not something that should be made difficult for people to use. And the one thing we should point out is when you change libraries, for example, like this, you'll actually see that we're showing a little spinny thing, and we'll actually disable the dropdown to prevent you from selecting the wrong item. Now, let's talk a little bit about the experience, right? What are we talking about when we're talking about dropdowns? I don't know about you, but it really bugs me when I go use an app or a website, and it's got for example, a list of countries and state or provinces. And if I select, I'm from Canada, so if I select Canada, it doesn't filter the list. It still shows Alabama. For those of you who don't know, Alabama is not a province in Canada. And the worst part about this is that then you'll get websites or applications that will say, "Hey, the state or the province you've selected is not valid, of course, because Alabama is not a valid state or province. So what you're telling me here is you knew it wasn't a valid choice, but you still let me pick it, right? So you might as well basically call the user a dummy, because that's how they feel. And again, I want to make one thing clear. When we're talking about these kinds of experiences, we have a tendency to say, oh, don't confuse the users. We need to stop treating users like they're weak, pathetic, fragile beings that can't handle tasks. We need to start thinking about the fact that very often we're all very busy. We're all very task oriented, and often we don't have time to read the text on a screen. And if we don't think about making things easier for our users, so in this case, preventing users from making a bad selection, we're really increasing the effort that they have to go through to make sure that they've entered the right information. And that's often referred as cognitive load. So the more cognitive load you inflict on your users, the less likely they are to like your solution. And it's not because you confuse them. It's because you make them feel stupid for making the wrong choice in the first place. Or you make them feel that your application is stupid, or they're stupid for deciding to use the application. And we don't want that, right? We want people to be able to achieve their goals as fast as possible without making mistakes. And this is something that in user experience, they'll often talk about putting guardrails to make sure that people don't make mistakes. So, for example, the other thing that we need to consider is that sometimes, we are task oriented. We want to get directly to the thing we want to do. And I said sometimes we're always task oriented, really. So we'll skip directly to the thing we want to do. In this case, if I know that my province is Ontario, I'll just go directly to the state province and I'll pick Ontario without really thinking about changing the country. Now, again, what will happen is we'll give a message like this. And it's not exactly the message we give, but that's the feeling that we're giving to our users, right? Hey, you need to pay attention. And so this is where we need to think about improving the user experience. Why did you let me select this in the first place? You clearly knew that this was not a valid option, right? And for the last year, we've been talking about using AI everywhere. But why can't we create systems that are very simple that help our users in the simplest ways? And what about the impact when you actually let the user save this choice? Like, what if I actually selected the wrong country to the right province here? Is there something behind the scenes that's going to break? Are you going to try to ship this to the state of Ontario in the United States? And so we have to think about these concepts. So a cascading dropdown is really something that's here to solve this problem. When I pick Canada, there you go, it automatically filters the list of options. So in this case, Alberta is the first province that's available in Canada. But what's even better here is we need to think about that relationship again between a parent dropdown and a child dropdown. And what I should probably do, if you think about it, because remember, I'm very task oriented, right? When I'm using this, when I change country, you probably shouldn't select the first option in the dropdown. You should probably blank out the option in the dropdown, unless, and the only exception to this is really if there's an option that is available for both the previous parent selection, and the new selection, that's the only time you should keep the same child drop-down selection enabled. All right, so let's talk about how we do this, though, in code. So in code, as you know, in the Webparts, we have a function called getPropertyPaneConfiguration. And what it does is it's responsible for giving you the list of controls to be displayed in the property pane. In this case, we have two options. One is the property pane dropdown for the parent, and one is the property pane dropdown for the child. And what we do is we bind the options that are available for the parent dropdown, we bind it to, in this case, the list of lists. And in the child dropdown, we bind it to the list of items. And we'll worry about populating that list of valid choices soon. But the one thing that we also do is we also tell it whether it's disabled or not. Because, again, remember, people can click really quickly without really worrying about things. I might take some time to load the list of choices. And while I'm loading, if I'm not indicating clearly that I'm loading, users might just start clicking around, right? So they might select an option and the option disappears. So disable the dropdown while you're loading the values. And then what we're using is a variable that stores whether the list is disabled or not. And then finally, of course, we're binding to the Webpart property called list name for my list of lists and to the item name for my list of items. Now, you'll notice one thing that's different about the child dropdown. I'm actually also using the selected key. Normally, when I change a value or when I bind a value in a dropdown to a Webpart property, it knows how to select the right value. But it's not always as reflective or responsive. So one issue that we ran into, and we solved this, is by forcing the selected key of the child, and we'll set it to blank when we change the dropdown. That forces the dropdown to say, okay, I understand, we've just changed the list. Now, where we store the information that we just talked about is, of course, in the list name and item name properties of the Webparts. In the Webpart itself, we have two variables that we use for our list of lists and our list of items, which are drop-down options that we'll select. I also have two variables to determine whether the dropdown is disabled or not. You'll notice I always start by having it disabled because the first thing that will happen when I display the property pane is I should be loading the data. So why set it to false and set it to true when we know it's always going to start as disabled? One last thing that we do set, though, is the loading indicator. And this is something where we'll tell you we're currently loading. We're going to do a little spinny thing. I know there's a better term for this, but that's what I like to call it. So we'll display the spinny thing to tell you that I'm working on something right now. Now, on property pane configuration start, I actually load. Well, first thing I do is I look to see if I should disable the list dropdown. So if I don't have a list of lists, I can't let you select the dropdown. I'll disable it. Now, if I have a list, but I don't have a list of items, then I'll disable the list of items as well. And then if there's nothing to do at this point, we'll just stop here. But this is where the fun starts. If I actually have a list of items and a list of lists, I can start using my loading indicator. So say, hey, I'm currently loading stuff. I will force a refresh to make sure that if you think about it, right, the property pane is trying to do as fast as it can, as responsively as it can. But by forcing it a refresh, I'm actually telling it, hey, go take a time to display the little spinny thing while I'm doing my loading. And so this is what you see here. When I'm loading my document, I'm getting a little spinny thing that's saying loading data. And when I change the list again, it does that. All right, so now that I have my spinny thing going, I am telling basically people that I'm doing some work. I can take my time to load the list. And the way I do this is by calling a function called load list. Now, you'll notice that I'm using an await indicator. So I'm telling it that this is an asynchronous function. That means that I'm telling SharePoint not to wait, or sorry, not to stop everything that's happening on the screen because I'm calling this function. I still want my web page to be responsive while I'm loading the data. So by using an await, it allows it to do this asynchronously. And one thing that I had to do to make sure that this worked is by making the property pane configuration start asynchronous as well. By doing that, it's telling the function I'm going to have some asynchronous calls within this. Now, once I have this list, I bind it to the list of options, and I can now stop disabling the list. And this is what you'll see here. You'll see that I have the list of items is disabled while I'm loading, but as soon as it's loaded, it returns to being enabled. All right, now how do I list a list of items from SharePoint? It's the same idea, right? I just call in a wait function to load the items. But at the end here, when we're all done, I basically clear the loading indicator. And again, I force a refresh of the property pane to make sure that everything is being displayed. All right, we're almost done here. Then how do I get the list of options, right? So one of the things that I do is, again, I said I call a asynchronous function called load list. Well, load list is a function that in our sample, we're hard coding a list of choices. In the real world, you would actually be making an API call, or you would be using PNP.js to make the calls. But this is what we're doing here. Again, this is an asynchronous function because we don't want everything to stop while we're loading. And what we're doing here is, in this sample, we're returning a hard-coded list of shared documents and my documents, which is what you see right here. Now, in our sample, we're using a timeout just to make it look like it's working hard. And that's actually what I do in the real world as well. It's waiting for 2 seconds. Of course, you don't want to wait when you're loading your samples, but again, because, or not your samples, your items, but because this is a sample and we wanted to really show the effect of that spinny thing and the disabling and all that stuff, we added some delays. Please remove that if you're doing that in real world. Loading the items is done the same way. It's an asynchronous function where we return the choices here depending on which items you've selected or which list you've selected. Again, you see that here. When I pick a different list, I get a different list of choices. There you go. Isaiah, whatever that name is. And then the list of shared documents, I got SPFx for the masses and Hello World. All right, we are almost done. The last thing we need to do really is when the property pane field is changed. Again, this is an asynchronous function. All I need to do is I need to say, hey, I'm loading. I make sure that I tell SharePoint that the property field has changed to make sure that it's reflected. And then the first thing I do, and this is usually something that we forget. In fact, we forgot this in the previous iteration of this sample. You should set the item to be an empty string. Don't use null or undefined. That's not going to force the dropdown to update. You need to set it to an empty string. That's going to force the child item to reset to nothing. And then we do the same thing. We disable things, we refresh things, we load things asynchronously. And once we're done, we store the items, we enable the selector, and we remove the loading indicator. And then for good measure, we refresh the property pane to make sure that the app is being responsive. Now on the on-property pane configuration start, what we used to do before is we used to do, call the function and then call a then, and we used to do something, and then we used to do then, right? Which is something called promises. Now, what we do in the newer version is we use await and async. So an await allows me to actually create code that is not chained and, and what's the word I'm looking for here? It'll come back to me. A function within a function within a function within a function. I'm able to create some linear code that basically says, look, I'm going to wait for this function to run. And once the function is completed, then I will move on to the next step. And we used to do in the previous version of our code, we used to actually call the display loading indicator. And what that did is that it caused it to display a loading indicator in the Webpart, which was a great way to do it. But if you think about it, recursive, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you. But if you think about it, if I'm using a mobile device, I might not actually see that the Webpart is currently loading. So the newer updated behavior is to use the show loading indicator attribute or property of the property pane, so that when I'm changing the values, show loading indicator equals true will actually display the loading indicator in the property pane, which is a more direct relationship to what we're working with. All right. So for more information about this, we have the article that I referred to on how to use cascading dropdowns in the Webpart properties, and we have the cascading dropdown Webpart. And this concludes my demo. I'd like to thank all the awesome presenters for today, Ejaz and Nishkalank, for their demos. And if you have any feedback on these calls, we would love to get your feedback. You can go to aknms.community/calls/feedback to give us feedback on what you think of these calls. Now, if you'd like to join our official Discord servers, please do so. This is where we have the ability to share knowledge, ask questions, stay up to date, post jokes, whatever you want. We love to see you there. And I'd like to apologize to Bo Cameron. We ran out of time. But thank you, everyone. The recording will be available in 24 hours on the YouTube channel. And you can follow us on Twitter at Microsoft 365 Dev and Microsoft 365 PnP. Our next Viva Connection SPFx call is going to be on November 2nd. Our next Microsoft 365 and Power Platform call is going to be on October 26th. And with that, thank you, everyone.
Woo!